Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this year's third Bartlett School of Planning Public Lecture. So as you'll know by now, the format for this year's series is very different to the past, and all lectures are online, unfortunately. We hope, of course, to get back to some normality for next year. My name is Nick Gallant, and I'm Professor of Housing and Planning here at UCL, and I'm going to chair this evening's event. So our public lectures, as many of you will know, are intended to bring leading international thinkers and practitioners on topics related to planning in the built environment before an audience of colleagues, students and guests. At the end of November, we welcomed Desiree Fields from the University of California, Berkeley, who shared her research on racialized geographies of housing financialization. There's been a bit of a gap since Desiree's lecture because we were intending to host Maria Adebowale Schwartz from the Foundation of London. Unfortunately, Maria was unable to deliver her lecture this year, but she will feature in the programme for the next session. In addition to today's lecture, the programme for the rest of the year also includes Professor Anne Forsyth from Harvard University, who will give this year's Sir Peter Hall lecture on healthy cities after COVID. And that will happen on the 20th of May at the normal time of 6 p.m. So please look at our website for details of the programme, and we hope to see you at future events. It's always been our custom, of course, on these occasions to offer some hospitality, usually down in the South Cloisters of the Wilkins building after these lectures and after the discussion is concluded. As you will have guessed, I'm sure that that's not going to be possible this year, but we hope that we will be able to resurrect that custom next year. So let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Libby Porter is Professor of Urban Planning at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Melbourne. Her work is about displacement and dispossession in cities, and this includes looking at urban policy and planning as tools of dispossession in settler-colonial cities and at the displacement effects of urban regeneration. Her work also explores urban governance and the politics of informality. Research on settler-colonial cities and post-colonial futures has been disseminated by Libby in her books Unlearning the Colonial Cultures of Planning, Planning for Coexistence, and Planning in Indigenous Australia. Libby has also taught here in the UK, previously in planning and geography schools at the universities of Birmingham, Sheffield, Glasgow, and back in Australia at Monash. She co-founded Planners Network, the Planners Network UK, which is a progressive voice for radical planning in the UK. She's an active member of the International Network of Urban Research and Action, and she's also an assistant editor of the journal Planning Theory and Practice. The title of her talk this evening, reflecting her long-standing research interest, is Precarities of Dwelling in the Settler-Colonial City. So there'll of course be an opportunity for questions at the end. You can either type these into the Q&A, maybe put them in as the talk progresses and we'll pick them up later, or there will be an opportunity to ask the questions directly. So without further ado, Libby, welcome to UCL and to the Bartlett School of Planning, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's lovely to join you all. Welcome, everyone. And I think I should say good evening, although I want to say good morning because it's very early in the morning here in Melbourne. It's terrific for you to host me, and really looking forward to an interesting conversation with you all. So it's I should share my screen, shouldn't I? It's a practice of law in the place where I'm located to situate myself and to acknowledge really the wider and much longer relationships that enable me to be here in this particular space, this especially dull looking room that I'm in the front of my house. And what enables me to be here. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to Wurundjeri people, to ancestors past, to elders present, to the people of country, and all of those who continue to and have always sustained and cared for country. And I want to acknowledge and honour country, which I see as a life world that sustains me and my family in this place, learning that by learning with Indigenous ways of understanding the relationship between people and place. To Indigenous peoples who might be present here today, my respects to you. I'm speaking as an uninvited guest, living on Wurundjeri lands, benefiting from the spoils of colonisation. And so my understanding of this practice of acknowledgement is not as a symbolic move to assuage guilt, but a practice of a lawful relationship with the sovereignty that has always been here, and trying to understand how to continue to practice that sovereignty or that relationship with sovereignty in new and better ways. I want to pick up many of those themes that I just spoke about in that brief acknowledgement by beginning my talk here to you tonight with 4 short stories from this little corner of the world here where I am on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. Also, its longer and more apt name, Naarm or Birrarunga. And these stories are, for me, really revealing of what I've called here the precarities of dwelling in the settler-colonial city. So I'm just going to launch right into those stories. Here's the first one. This extraordinary building, the William Barrett building, which I've written about before, and some of you may have seen in some of the work that I've done. This extraordinary building was revealed to the city of Melbourne. It's at the top end of the city spine, the civic spine, at the top of Swanston Street, in March 2015, when some enormous drapes that were covering the entire thing were kind of unveiled, were dropped to reveal this colossal face staring down the city's main thoroughfare towards the Shrine of Remembrance at the other end. And the face in the facade that you can start to make out here is that of William Barrett, a Nurrungita or head elder, chief person, head or leader of the Wurundjeri people, who a very important ancestor, very, very important leader, who lived through the early contact period of colonisation here in this place. So he was about 10 years old, I think, when, or thereabouts, when John Batman and his cronies sailed in and started taking over. The building that you see here is a relatively high-end residential apartment block built by a quite well-known and rather infamous developer called Grocon, owned by the Grollo family, who actually have a house just around the corner from me here. So there's a weird set of interconnections here. So it's a visually striking building, obviously, and it's present in the city in a quite colossal way, although I'm always struck by the number of visitors to Melbourne who have actually never noticed it, because I don't think we look up anymore when we walk around the city. But it's a really quite striking feature in Melbourne's urban landscape. But it raises some really interesting questions about the nature of Wurundjeri settler relations here in Melbourne, in Naarm Birrarunga, but also more widely, the question of Indigenous settler relations in cities that are structured through settler-colonial dynamics of power anywhere in the world. So in this building, this is a very, if we think about it, this is a very important leader of the Wurundjeri people, rendered into or moulded into the facade of a private apartment building on land that was stolen from his people. This is his stolen country that it's built on, through the process of settler-colonial urbanisation. And all of that is done here, is rendered here in the form of this building in the name of recognition and reconciliation. And this work of kind of making visible was really central to the architect's intention with this building, and indeed with the work that was undertaken, I should say, with the Wurundjeri Land Council, the kind of body that represents Wurundjeri interests, who praise the building. They feel it's a symbol of recognition and respect, though certainly not all members of the Wurundjeri community would agree with that, as was revealed in a number of public discussions. In fact, at a public forum discussing this building when it was unveiled, the lead architect, Howard Raggett, described the image as filling the void of absence, I quote, and that he diagnosed had been the plight of Aboriginality in the city of Melbourne since it was founded in 1835. And of course, there has been a profound absence of what white people anyway can recognise as Aboriginality in Melbourne, because the invasion of this particular place was one of the most rapid in British colonial history. The town of Melbourne was set up smack in the middle of the best places here on the river, now called the Yarra, but properly called Birrarung, and on important Kulin meeting places. Food sources were destroyed, access and mobility around country was obviously extremely curtailed, disease and murder decimated populations very, very rapidly. So just 5 years later in 1840, just down the road from this, the now road from this building, around 300 Kulin people, including Wurundjeri people, who were camped on the south bank of the Birrarung, were surrounded by police and driven through the streets at gunpoint and locked up because people, of course, were settlers, had become disturbed by, what they saw as the Aboriginal problem in the city. And later that year, Governor Latrobe prohibited Aboriginal people from coming within 20 miles of the township, a line that was very heavily and brutally policed. So we can see in this image this kind of rendering of Aboriginal people outside the city. Now, William Barrack at this time was a teenager. He was present as a boy at the signing of, where he was thought to be, at the signing of John Batman's infamous treaty, so-called, with, need to use scare quotes with that, with Kulin leaders in 1835. And really the subject of Barrack himself and his life became a selling point for the building, in a kind of what I would describe as an archetypal move to innocence by the architect. So here is the quote on the architect's website that explains the nature of the building, where they say William Barrack, it's often spelt in different ways, is traditional Nurrungit or elder of the Wurundjeri Willem clan, and the cultural resonance, they claim, of William Barrack gazing down the civic axis of Melbourne towards the post-Federation Shrine of Remembrance stands to unite the city's modern heritage with its deep history. And I think this last part of this comment is very interesting in the way that it attempts to move towards innocence by smoothing over the deep fracturing work and indeed very violent work of colonisation, with this kind of promise of reconciling with deep time, and at the same time titillating the settler imagination with this kind of false promise of authentic connection, creating an object here that we can see and point to and say, hey, we recognised and we reconciled. So by making this really big statement of recognition, it's literally a facade, at the very, is a sort of statement at the very same time reiterates and deepens what Gowanpool scholar Aileen Morton Robinson has identified as white possessiveness. So this possessiveness is both of the land itself in the form of property entitlement, as well as the deployment of the image. An image like this has an intervention in contemporary practices of reconciliation. Both of these are practices of the settler-colonial condition of perpetuating white possessiveness. For, of course, recognition and reconciliation is not at all what this building is about. Hardly anyone in Melbourne or visiting Melbourne knows who this is. William Barrack is a relatively little known figure. And indeed, at the public forum that was discussing this building not long after it was revealed, the architect, in a very tense exchange with a Wurundjeri elder, Arnie Joy Murphy, Wandon Murphy, who I'll quote later actually, he let slip that it actually didn't matter who it was when he was accused of rendering someone who was unrecognisable. He said, it could be Jesus Christ or Che Guevara or Karl Marx. The point was to invite conversation. An interesting slippage indeed. And anyways, how would anyone know who it was? Because or have a conversation about who it is, because there's no explanation or identification given to any viewer of the building down on the street. To the foyer to this building is entirely given over to the celebration of beer culture, very macho Australian beer culture, because it stands on the site of a former brewery on the Carlton and United Brewery site. And the only reference, and it's a curious one, to the identity of the face is the sentence, apologies, my slides are out of order, is the sentence, Wurundjeri, I am who I am, which is rendered in enormous braille letters, I suppose, silver discs, if you can see them under Barak's chin here at the base of the facade, but that sits about 2 stories above the street under his chin. So Wurundjeri I am who I am, rendered in Braille in an entirely nonsensical way. According to the architect, it's Braille as a message for, and I quote, for those willing to explore beyond the obvious. So my point here is not sort of to poke at the architectural nonsense that's obviously, you know, here, utterly trite, vacuous kind of statements. Those should be obvious enough, but more to really set the scene of this kind of dispossessory intent and the ongoing practice of settler colonialism here in the city. So to move to story 2, a very different but not far away from that building, story about an occupation in about a year later that this building was unveiled in March 2016. When around 50 people organised through the Homeless Persons Union of Victoria squatted an empty street, or squatted a street of empty houses in the inner city neighbourhood of Collingwood, which is a rapidly gentrifying part of the city. Many of the people who squatted the homes were Aboriginal, some of them were Wurundjeri themselves, houseless on their own country, on their own lands. Now, the homes were empty to begin with. These particular houses you can see in the photograph here. They were empty because the state government had acquired them as part of a very controversial road project called the East-West Link that would have linked via a tunnel the freeway systems in the east to the west of Melbourne. And there had been huge public debate about this and it dominated the 2014 state election and indeed had changed the government as a consequence, which saw that election saw the Labor Party sweep to power on the promise of tearing up the contract, which it duly did, to build that road. And one outcome was that this little street next to the freeway, the existing freeway, had been compulsorily acquired, and all its owners had been, all the previous residents had been moved out, and it was suddenly left empty with no apparent purpose, and no one could figure out what to do next. So the purpose of the occupation was to politicise the housing crisis in Melbourne, where, you know, hundreds of homes, including these ones, are left empty while thousands sleep rough every night. And the occupation demanded that the homes be immediately turned into public housing, and of course were, you know, demanding a wider investment more generally in public housing. In the story, they managed to stay on for many months. They eventually occupied around 10 of the homes in Bendigo Street. There were successive waves of police action and evictions, and a series of Supreme Court injunctions against evictions. They used the law in extremely savvy ways to try and extend their occupation throughout almost the entirety of 2016. I think it was around October of that year, they were finally given notice, and a number of First Nations people, including a Wurundjeri man, were arrested quite brutally by Victoria Police without charge. And then a Supreme Court ordered the recovery of the houses in mid-November. So they were out by the end of the year. But I think, again, this reveals some interesting tensions and contradictions. Here's, you know, Collingwood, an inner city suburb, hyperinflated property market, rapid gentrification, but also deepening poverty, lots of rough sleeping, you know, the kind of classic contradiction of uneven urban development, and also a place of extraordinary importance for Aboriginal communities across Australia, actually, but in Victoria in particular, not only because it's Wurundjeri country, but also because of the way in which this inner city neighbourhood has become home to lots of Aboriginal people displaced and dispossessed from other parts of the country who found their way to this particular place. So it's the home of a large number of Aboriginal community controlled services and a kind of incredibly significant place for all sorts of reasons, for meeting and social support and community organised values and support networks. So this story, I think, reveals a number of different elements of the way in which, you know, if we set it against the Barak building, you know, high-end apartment building with an Aboriginal leader's face on it, and here a year later is people being arrested and evicted from homes that have been left empty through a failed urbanisation process. So I want to move to story 3, which again is different, but but linked, as I'm going to try and describe in a short moment. And that's the Public Housing Renewal Program, which is a quite large-scale policy platform of the current Labor government, who have self-described as the most progressive government in Australia, which I disagree with. Actually, that's probably true, but it's a very low bar to be comparing from, so it doesn't say terribly much. But this policy platform is one of wide-scale renewal of public housing estates around the city of Melbourne. It originally included about 9 public housing estates, mostly through the inner and middle suburbs, and now has been sort of extended through a recent announcement of the Victorian government called the Big Housing Build to around 12 public housing estates that have been kind of deemed tired and not fit for purpose. The usual kind of familiar story of strategic disinvestment being used to create the conditions for the new capitalisation of inner city land. Now, to give a bit of context about public housing in Victoria, public housing here has always been a tiny proportion of Australia's housing system. Australia's never seen fit to sort of properly invest in public housing. We have, as I'm sure you're aware, a deeply entrenched culture of private home ownership, and a sense that if you haven't achieved private home ownership, you've kind of failed the basic test of sort of Australianness or humanity indeed. So there's been this really deep marginalisation of public housing, and in the last 20 years, I would say a further residualisation of public housing in Victoria, where there's been large-scale privatisation and a kind of pushing or residualising of public housing to the hardest to house, and increasingly a shift to the provision of what is used, the term that's used as the kind of catch-all umbrella term of social housing, shifting public housing units out of public ownership and transferring them to community housing, non-government providers, and their tenancies, and effectively privatising the provision of social housing. So that's what's going on in the Public Housing Renewal Program. It's badged as Renewal. It will redevelop these 12 inner city, inner and middle ring estates across Melbourne that have been, strategically disinvested over time and are falling apart. And it will replace those entirely public housing sites, as they are at the moment, with a mix of both private housing and social housing, all of which will be delivered by non-government, not-for-profit community housing providers. So effectively privatising both the land and privatising the provision of non-market housing. Now, the estate near where I live, which is pictured here, is Walker Street in Northcote. And on this map, it is just about bang dead in the middle of your screen, S38. These are some of the sites across Melbourne. You can see roughly where they are in the sort of inner north, basically. Walker Street Northcote, or Walker Street Westgarth, is a low-rise walk-up kind of situation. It housed about 87 families, really well located because it's just a few kilometres from the city centre to services and transport, but it occupies really prime real estate between the banks of the very lovely Merry Creek, which is a tributary, of course, of the Birrarung, and the now very trendy Northcote High Street. Walker Street estate is basically now a pile of rubble. All of the residents have been displaced over the last few years, sometimes to quite far away parts of the city and beyond. And to sort of explain a little bit more of that story, and I want to reveal here the kind of the detail, the minutiae of the kind of pain and injury of relocation. I want to show you a very short clip from a film that's being made about the displacement of 2 families in particular from this particular estate, because there's been obviously a very wide-scale struggle against it, as evidenced by this sign that someone wrote on the stairwell of at Northcote, public housing land is not for sale. And this short clip really reveals the kind of tensions and contradictions in the lived experience of being forced to relocate, the sort of stress and despair, the fear and violence of having really no choice in your dwelling experience being shifted and being changed. So I'm going to do the tech thing and try and stop sharing this screen and start sharing a different screen in the hope that this works. And Victoria or Nick, if you could tell me if the sound doesn't work, and because I don't want it to be poor quality sound. It only goes for 2 or 3 minutes. Let me know if it doesn't work.
For me, living here is really difficult for a number of reasons.
So Nada, ask me a question. How are you going? Good for your life. Oh, that's good. Tell me the truth because I know your life.
All right, so this is Najat's a notice to vacate, and the reason given is that this will be demolished. For me, living here is really difficult for a number of reasons, and it's complex. And one of the things is that very few people here left, but my neighbour Najat is still here. Her 4 children, all young. I've promised her many, many times that I won't leave before her, but I sort of have. Across Victoria, public housing is being sold for private redevelopment. Despite a waiting list of over 100,000 people, these new developments will provide no additional public housing.
You have here 80 people, you have to have 80 houses. And before you get the houses, you have to ask everyone where.
Where we live is much better, to be honest.
Yes, I agree.
My place is much better. You know, my place, I like.
I know, same here. We've been saying this for 3 years, but it's that the people who made those decisions, we don't even know who they are, but they were made 3 years ago, and we have to live with what has happened.
The fact of the matter is that they don't have hardly any 4-bedroom places, but they don't have anywhere else to offer you for quite a long time.
Okay, if you can.
You know, I think you need to take the best place you can from them now. You know, like I really do. You want to stay in public housing because they've got no houses. They're knocking them all down. I think things are going to get better. I really do. Doesn't mean I think they're necessarily going to be better tomorrow. Along the way, they might get worse. But part of things are going to get better includes that you have to experience just difficult things.
Hopefully that sound worked okay for you all. And you could hear the stories of pain and injury involved in relocation. Sorry, Nick.
I said we could hear it okay. It was great.
Excellent, excellent. Very pleased to hear that. I'll try and remember to put the link in the chat so that you can go watch it another time. That documentary is being made by my comrade in the Save Public Housing Collective, Lucy McMahon, and both William and Najat featured there are involved in much wider scale struggles against public housing renewal across the city. So I want to move on to story 4. Which is also a public housing story of the hard lockdown that occurred in 9 public housing towers in inner Melbourne, in North Melbourne and Flemington, during our long COVID lockdown in Melbourne last year in 2020. The COVID story in Melbourne has been a kind of odd one, I suppose, sort of really a story of botched hotel quarantine that has led us into 2 of the 3 lockdowns we've had. The one last year lasted lasted around 4 months. We were under curfew every night, which was a weird experience. And just as we were entering that 4-month lockdown in July last year, the state government, without warning, placed more than 3,000 residents of 9 public housing towers in hard lockdown, requiring all residents to remain in their flats, in their apartments, and not leave for 5 days. A police cordon was set up, you can see here in the image, was set up at the base of all of the buildings. There were police on every floor, police in the lifts, there were police in corridors outside people's homes, and it was literally set up, that police cordon. The police literally arrived as the Premier announced that this was what they were going to do. So there was no warning to a community of people who have been over-policed for decades. Many, of course, have come from refugee and asylum seeker backgrounds and other kinds of marginalised backgrounds who are dreadfully over-policed, who experience this kind of terror of hundreds of armed police just arriving in trucks and booze buses and drug-busting buses, setting up a blockade at the base of every building. Now, the government justified this action, saying that the residents were vulnerable because they live in high density, buildings such as this one here, with lots of shared spaces, in shared lifts, sometimes shared bathrooms and laundries as well. And there were a few and growing COVID cases, of course, in the buildings. All of that is true, of course, although that would be true of every large apartment building in Melbourne in which there were COVID cases. And there are hundreds of those kinds of buildings, all the same, of a similar kind of variety through Melbourne, and none of them were treated to this particular kind of level of policing and this particular kind of hard lockdown. So what unfolded in the following 48 hours of this hard lockdown being underway was a kind of botched delivery of any kind of basic service to people in their homes. There were lots of stories of inappropriate food arriving cold in the middle of the night, dumped outside people's doors. There was lack of medical facilities and supplies. There was shocking misinformation. People just didn't know what was going on, and lots of images of signs like this, and people pressed up against their windows saying, "Please help, let us out." It was a pretty distressing time. And perhaps the only thing that really prevented people from going entirely hungry and not having what they needed was the mobilisation at an extraordinary scale of grassroots networks and organisations which had been active and thriving, of course, in these communities for decades, but had always been ignored by government. They just sprang into action and organised within hours a colossal relief effort, delivering hundreds of meals and care packages of essential items, coordinating activities for kids who were sort of locked up inside tiny apartments, extra help for school students who didn't have laptops or internet and all these kinds of things. And there were plenty of stories that emerged, of course, of how poor the COVID response had been by the landlord, the Department of Housing and Human Services, up to this point, with relatively little information provided, not provided in other languages. Poor maintenance of necessary supplies like hand sanitizer and all those kinds of things were underway. So the reason for sharing this story is that, here's just life being made kind of even more unbearable for 3,000 people simply because of their status as public housing tenants. So their precarity here comes not from their tenure, because public housing is a very secure tenure, it being lifelong in Australian law, but from the conditions that curtailed their capacity to dwell. So I want to spend a few moments now just sort of drawing these 4 stories together. They might seem at first blush a little bit the same and yet really quite different, but I want to sort of pick up and tease out some of the ways that I think they illuminate the precarities of dwelling in the settler colonial city. So conventional housing analyses are, of course, they're kind of helpful for revealing what's going on here. We see lots of familiar themes: displacement and gentrification, class restructuring, and the intensifying capital extraction from inner city land, as well as just plain old-fashioned raw racism. But what I'm really interested in pursuing here a little more sort of explicitly is the lines of connection between these stories, and try and knit them into a fuller social geography of this little corner of the world here on Wurundjeri country. So simply registering that these are all actually occurring on Wurundjeri country, on the stolen land of William Barrack's people, I think begins to help us to do that. So here's a kind of mapping of those in a fairly conventional form. But here I don't want to look so much at a sort of 2D image of a map, or thinking about as housing, I suppose, in its conventional sense, whether that be sort of tenure or built form. I want to think instead with the concept of dwelling as a more expansive vocabulary that I think can help explain what Lauren Ballon has described as, and here I'm quoting, a more capacious range of activity oriented toward the reproduction of ordinary life. Now, of course, there's a lot of thinking about dwelling, going back to Heidegger, where to dwell is to be set at peace, or is to remain at peace within a free sphere, I'm quoting, that safeguards each thing in its own nature, as Heidegger said. So, dwelling is staying with things. It suggests emplacement, or some quality of connection and relationality with these kind of wider social geographies. But in this place here on Wurundjeri country, there is an even longer line of thinking that's often ignored or misrecognised in very white stream disciplines like ours in planning and geography. And Indigenous people here and elsewhere have been asking us to understand very different philosophies of place and belonging for a very long time. And so I've been trying to learn with those philosophies as a route to a more appropriate theorisation of these phenomena underway here, about being grounded in the place where I am. So Indigenous worldviews see country, as I spoke about earlier, as sentient and relational. It's bound into intense relations of kinship and responsibility. Indigenous belonging comes from what Aileen Morton Robinson describes as an ontological relationship to country derived from the dreaming. It's a form of embodiment that occurs, as she explains, through the intersubstantiation of ancestral beings, humans, non-humans, and land. So in this sense, land is already related to people. And if we think about that and its expression here in Melbourne, here's a quote from Auntie Joy Wandon Murphy, a Wurundjeri elder, the person who was in conversation with Howard Raggett, architect, about the rendering of her ancestor William Barrack on that building, and she says here, this is our place, and that place comes from knowing this special story, this important story of creation. We're born from this land, we take care of this land, but then she expands that responsibility out to say that everyone has a place on this land. Everyone has to find a place, but find it in their responsibility to nurture and to look after this place. So this sort of emplacement, this belonging, also comes with this responsibility. Another way of describing this is offered by Kombumerri scholar Mary Graham, where she talks about, in a very important paper, the precepts of the Aboriginal world, what she describes as the Aboriginal worldview, in these two forms. The land is the law, so law comes from country. You can't be separated from it in that sense, and you're not alone in the world. So everyone is connected into these relationships with each other, both human and non-human, and with country. Now, of course, colonisation is a violent attempt at disrupting and dispossessing these relations, and as Tanganaka scholar Irene Watson has often reminded us, the housing crisis for Aboriginal people here in Australia began in 1788, and in Melbourne it began in 1835 when John Batman and his cronies, sailed in with their guns and their sheep and their sense of entitlement. But if we take seriously, and I think we should, what Mary Graham and Arnie Joy are teaching us here, that separation, that dispossession can never be complete as long as country still exists, and as long as the people of country remain in relationship. So country doesn't go away. It's considered another way, if you think about it, through the worldview of the Palawa people, whose country is now the state of Tasmania. The sky is the roof. So you can't go outside. You're always inside. You're inside the hearth of home. So thinking with these kinds of concepts seems to me to offer quite different access points into what's going on in these little stories that I've shared, and what's at stake actually in the contemporary politics of dwelling today. I think it opens up much more relational and sentient life world understandings that move us beyond quite two-dimensional or sectoral ways of conceiving of neighbourhoods and housing. So I want to conceptualise dwelling then as a generative practice of becoming home. And here I'm really resting resting on and inspired by fabulous work on dwelling coming out from the Radical Housing Journal Collective, amongst others, of how we might rethink and conceptualise dwelling in ways that radically exceeds the norms and conventional understandings of home being private property or rental tenure or four walls and a roof of particular urban forms or built forms. And instead think of dwelling as embodied and experiential, as a coming into being rather than something that's fixed and normatively sort of stable, or that should be fixed and normatively stable in particular kinds of forms. So I think this kind of helps us think through these ideas of the sustenance of being emplaced and what that means. Because of course, when that emplacement and the sustaining of that emplacement is fractured, in order to dwell well, we need that sustenance of emplacement to be continually reproduced every day and on into the future. There has to be some kind of ontological futurity in dwelling. So when that isn't existing, we have what I'm trying to think of here as precarities of dwelling, where the conditions of emplacement and security have been rendered unstable or uncertain. Now, I'm conscious that there are lots of differences between terms like precarious and precarity. In Butler's terms, we would think about being, we're always precarious in every sense, in that we're dependent on, as she describes, the grace or will of another. And I think that's important. And I think property, for example, is a really great example of that. It's fully relational in that sense. We're always organised. I think Nick Blomley's got an excellent quote, it's property law is the means by which codependency is organised. So it's intensively precarious in that sense. But when we think about precarity, I want to work with concepts that really coming out from wide range of thinkers, including Judith Butler, Lauren Ballont, Sarah Ahmed, others, and thinking about what Ballont describes as precarity as a set of dissolving assurances or cruel optimisms that define this particular set of circumstances that people find themselves in. So beyond episodes of crisis, more thinking about the crisis ordinary, the ways in which in these small stories that I've shared, we might be able to attend to these much more diffuse processes of the production of precarity, of the ways in which our social geographies are organising to produce precarity and to impose it on certain kinds of bodies. So I think that's important, but to kind of make that a little bit clearer, I suppose, or I hope it makes it a little bit clearer. I think it's also important to just disrupt slightly the idea of displacement. And here I'm really inspired by the work of Oren Yiftahel on displaceability, because I think sometimes in the displacement field, and as Nick introduced earlier, I've done a lot of work on this over the years. It often sets us up into a way of thinking about displacement or a way of thinking about what's going on in being rendered precarious. As in these stories, that's a little bit too mechanical, or is a little bit too temporally located or geographically specific, as if one is displaced from there to here in a certain kind of time frame, and can't really attend to the wider kind of processes and phenomena that are underway to create forms of what Yiftahel calls displaceability. And here I'm riffing off his work to describe displaceability as the condition of being rendered susceptible to being involuntarily distanced from the resources and rights that hold up the capacity to dwell. And I think this is a really useful way of thinking about what's going on in the ways in which certain kinds of bodies are made displaceable, certain kinds of bodies are rendered disposable, and that where states and societies have said we're no longer going to hold up their capacity to dwell. Now, of course, there's wide scholarship on this in our field, and there's way too many people to mention in terms of the ways this is being thought about. I want to briefly just, gesture towards people who are influential on my thinking here. Baxter and Brickell's work on the unmaking of home, Elliot Cooper, Hubbard and Lees on unhoming as a multiscalar, geographically stretched phenomenon. Oren's work as well on grey spacing and displaceability. and of course the ways in which a huge range of much more ethnographic work that is really exposing the lived experience and effective dimensions of unhoming that have been offered by all sorts of people, Mark Freed and Anya Roy, Tom Slater, Yunpeng Zhang, and others who are trying to make these connections. So this for me is important because I want to connect back to these ways of thinking that I've just described with these Indigenous philosophies that help us understand the particularities of the settler-colonial condition. Because I think then we can see how the settler-colonial condition and the nature of unhoming are so intimately linked, where really unhoming or becoming displaceable is constitutive of the settler-colonial context and perhaps even exceeds the Indigenous settler dynamic that's often the sole focus of settler-colonial studies. And I guess what I mean is that people-place relationships have since invasion on this continent been structured in this way. They have been structured towards the condition of displaceability. And while that affects First Peoples first, of course, it also sits underneath all of our relationships through the regimes of property and whiteness that function to structure them. So in other words, the collusion of capitalism and colonisation really renders fragile all of our webs that hold us together in place. And that's why I want to really think about precarity in this way, this kind of, here I'm following the wonderful work of Melinda Hinkson, where she describes precarity as the ontological disembedding of people from their distinctively place-based associations. So what renders fragile these webs that hold us into these associations, whatever they may be, whether they be fleeting or long-standing, whether they be mobile or static, no matter what they are, how can we understand these kinds of ways of thinking? So I want to draw it to a kind of conclusion there, I suppose, and think about how precarious dwelling can offer really a new sort of analytic for grasping these different kinds of vectors. And in doing so, just conclude with why I think that might be important. And one of the reasons that I think it might be important is because I think it helps with some more precise ways of speaking against and beyond the kinds of rhetoric that comes out from a lot of our fields. I think certainly in urban planning, we hear this a lot in Melbourne, and I'm sure it's prevalent in the UK and elsewhere as well, about how to solve the so-called housing crisis. For example, using shipping containers to solve the housing crisis, or using sleeping pods to kind of warehouse people in literally on the side of the road so that they have this kind of notional shelter. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the concept of dwelling can help really expose how insufficient, how frankly offensive these kinds of supposed solutions are, as well as do other things as well. I think in helping us understand, where we're located and what this sort of rippling effect of displaceability is across the settler-colonial condition, of course experienced by First Peoples first, but also experienced and exceeding those relationships. So in that way, then we come to see, the barrack building as a sort of 80-foot obfuscation, not a symbol of visibility or recognition. We come to see struggles for public housing and for housing justice as statements about the capacity to dwell, rather than arguments about what is the right housing form or the right tenure for constructing the conditions of dwelling. And these seem to me to offer some new and really more hopeful lines of thinking. So thanks so much for listening. I'm looking forward to thoughts and reflections.
Okay, Libby, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. The sound on the video was really good.
Oh, good.
It was very clear. So straight away, I'll open it up to any questions that we might have from members of the audience. Oren says it was a great lecture. I'm not sure if he has a question. We're getting lots of praise, but
oh, thank you. Praise is nice. 6 in the morning.
Just a question that I had. You started off with story one and the story of the tower and the architect and the architect's vacuous statements about what he wanted to achieve through the symbolism that he was offering the city. And then later on, you answered my question, which my question was going to be, he started a conversation. In what direction do Aboriginal people want that conversation to go? And I thought that, you know, you answered it when you referred to one of the elders who was talking about, you know, the possibilities of sharing the land and respecting the land and all of that. But there must be also palpable anger amongst many people in Melbourne, many Aboriginal people and others as well. Where would they practically want the conversation to go? What sort of restitution for the situation that they find themselves in would be popular?
It's a great question, Nick. And of course, like any community, there is a wide range of divergent views amongst people. You may or may not be aware that the Victoria is the only state in Australia to be pursuing a treaty conversation, finally, with Aboriginal people in Victoria. And that seemed momentarily to offer some hope because, of course, treaty has been a request, a demand from Aboriginal people right across Australia for a very long time. And here the Victorian government has finally stood up and said, yes, we should do that. Unfortunately, it's structured its conversation in a particular kind of way that has engendered an enormous division between those who in the Aboriginal community who say, this is probably the best we'll ever get and we need to grasp it and go with it and see what we can kind of wrest from it. And others who say this is a fundamental abrogation of our sovereignty because of the nature of the way in which the Victorian government has structured the conversation in sort of obvious ways, like the Victorian government hasn't recognised the sovereignty of Indigenous people. So it sort of started from the foot of going, we want to consult with you about what kind of treaty we should have, as well as, which is really offensive to Indigenous people, as well as by taking off the table any substantive conversation about things like land reparations. So there's a really strong movement in Victoria and in fact a whole grassroots network that's set up around the concept of pay the rent, where individuals and organisations can offer some kind of financial compensation to the people on whose stolen land they live and work, as well as offer other forms of reparation. So their labour, their support, their allyship, turning up to things, those kinds of things. So those are the web of demands and aspirations, I think, that Aboriginal people in Victoria really have.
So that there is, I guessed that there might be a land reparation debate. But is that important across Australia? Because from what you said, you obviously provide a lot more nuance to the situation than I could guess at. But is there a sort of broader reparation debate across Australia, and how popular is it with governments, and how popular is it with the wider electorate?
There's a very wide reparation debate across Australia. And it's pretty riven by the nature of the legacy of colonisation, I suppose. It's very unpopular with governments for obvious reasons. Perhaps the best example of it is what happened when native title was recognised by the High Court in 1992 and then brought into the Australian legal system through the Native Title Act, and all of the state governments then enacted their own version of recognition of native title, I suppose, or a system for working out the recognition of native title. It's a bit detailed to go into, but the politics of that was that a massive backlash against Indigenous people. And I was reflecting on this the other day because someone was asking me about it. And I remember, the headlines at the time where, certainly the Premier of Victoria at the time, Jeff Kennett, was describing how, the Aborigines are coming for your backyard kind of thing. And there were literally evocations of blackfellas arriving in, vans and just, camping on your lawn because suddenly we decided to recognise that this was their space. And this, everyone else would kind of get kicked out. So there was this highly racialised, extremely regressive form of public debate. And I don't think that really has gone away. I don't think we've really matured that conversation terribly much, much to Indigenous people's great concern, and we continue to see the ways in which racial legacies of colonisation play out for Aboriginal people.
Great, thanks. I've got a few questions now from members of the audience, so I'm going to read them. The
please.
webinar format doesn't really lend itself to open discussion.
No.
So people are locked away, and
Yeah.
I'm seeing the questions in the question and answer box. So I'll throw a few at you. So we have a question from Claire Colomb, who says it's a very inspiring lecture. Thanks, Libby. Could you tell us more about the different concrete claims and campaigns about land, housing or dwelling, which are led by Indigenous groups in Melbourne? So are there any particular campaigns?
Well, I mentioned a couple of them just now. I mean, the broad treaty campaign is all about, in my view, dwelling, if we think about it in these terms. And that's why I think it's useful to think about it in these terms. So if we, moving away from concepts of, not that we should let them go, obviously, but land rights, it can be such a problematic way of thinking about what those claims are, I think, because it tends to immediately reduce them into a set of legally recognisable rights that always, by definition, starts to constrain the kinds of practices and the kinds of ontological forms of belonging that Indigenous people both have and are seeking to practice. So it automatically just subsumes them within a Western conception of what would be the kind of housing right or land right that could sort of, answer this person's claim or answer this person's aspiration. So this kind of treaty call in Indigenous people's terms is that call, I think. But there are obviously a huge range of other things as well. And perhaps another example, just to try and kind of give a different flavour of it, would be the movement for Aboriginal community controlled housing in Victoria. So one of the stock transfers from public housing that's happened in Victoria is to the Aboriginal Housing Corporation, who are obviously organisation of Indigenous people who are managing the tenancies and now the stock and title of what was formerly public housing and is now under their control, housing Aboriginal people. But with enormously divisive outcomes, actually, because of the kind of legacies of corporatisation, I suppose. So here's the Aboriginal Housing Corporation, and obviously don't wish to be too critical because actually they do great work. It is a highly corporate kind of body, and it really has to dance to the tune of government, because it's government that sets the rules about what are the nature of the tenancy agreements and how can this all unfold. So I think there's all sorts of housing and land claims underway in Victoria and Melbourne at the moment that can help reveal some of these interesting aspects of dwelling, I think.
Great, thanks.
Probably very well. Sorry,
quite a lot of questions coming through quite rapidly.
Okay.
So I think actually I've got a note from Vicky saying that maybe Claire wanted to ask that question directly. So apologies to Claire, but Claire, if you want to come back, please just put in another question and we'll try and bring you on microphone. I've got a question from Oren. This is his question. While the four stories connect well together in terms of current precarity, it was less clear how they connect conceptually. In shorthand, it seems like the weak settlers or inferior settlers are put in the same side as the profoundly displaced Indigenous. Surely the nature, depth and future of their precarity is different in terms of individual and collective right to the city. Would love to hear, oh, it's just disappeared. Sorry, would love to hear more on this comparatively and conceptually.
Oh, that was a question I knew would come from Oren on this. Thanks, Oren, for throwing me a curly one. So how to start? Conceptually, you're right in the sense that there is a qualitative difference between what we might think of as the futurity of Indigenous peoples on their own country, or indeed not on their own country, but living on someone else's country, so to speak. So not Wurundjeri people living here in Melbourne, for example, who are still Aboriginal people coming from elsewhere. There is a qualitative difference between their futurity and their precarity, the nature of their precarity, and that experience by, other bodies that are classed and racialised differently from Indigenous peoples, or as you say, kind of weaker versions of settlers, or however you want to describe that. That is true, and I don't wish to suggest that those are equal or that we should see them in the same way. What for me is interesting conceptually is the way in which the understanding of placemaking from an Indigenous perspective can help reveal what's at stake for those other classed and racialised and gendered bodies that are being made precarious in the settler-colonial city, on another side of the settler-colonial dynamic, and still being made precarious beyond the terms of that we would normally think of as just sort of housing rights. So to me, this, I guess what I'm saying is the notion of emplacement that I think Indigenous philosophies of place can help us see better, can help us see in more robust and rounded terms, is a much more useful way of attending to what's going on when people are displaced and relocated and made precarious in the terms of their dwelling, because then we're not solving it with sleeping pods or shoved on the sides of roads, or warehousing people in shipping containers, or just shoving them wherever across the city. We're taking seriously that the web of interconnection with the life world, with country, matters. It matters in serious material ways to everybody's life. And that's what I draw from, say, Arnie Joy's evocation of Wurundjeri ontology in this place. Everyone has a place to belong. That's the invitation to the sovereign relationship in a settler colonial context here. I can only speak of this one here in Melbourne. That invitation is to belong, but it's to belong on certain terms with certain forms of responsibility. And so that's conceptually what I'm trying to play with. I probably didn't explain it very well in the talk, but that's what I'm trying to draw out. I hope that helps a little bit. Thanks, Oren, for the question.
Great, thanks. I've got some questions in question and answer and some questions in chat. So a plea to the audience: please put your questions in question and answer, because then I can see what's going on. Otherwise, I'm trying to deal with two separate boxes. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Manuel Lutz from Berlin, who says, "Awesome lecture, very inspiring. In the interest to sharpen the proposed conceptual vocabulary, could you discuss how displaceability is different to vulnerability, which is by now a so much used policy term, especially to describe or recognize poor and marginalized populations?"
Well, that's a good one. I think there's certainly, well, I think I used the word, didn't I? Indeed, Oren uses the word, becoming vulnerable, becoming susceptible to being vulnerable is a kind of core part of displaceability. But I think they're different things. I mean, I think vulnerability gets misused so much, particularly in really slippery policy language, because it sort of responsibilizes, doesn't it, those who are being marked out as poor and marginalized. So becomes their problem in a way, that you've become vulnerable to this, or you're poor because you're vulnerable to income disadvantage, or whatever it might be. I think displaceability signals to us this concept of place, and dwelling as a practice of being emplaced, being held up by conditions that enable you to have the capacity to dwell on your own terms, which is a perhaps more precise component of being rendered vulnerable to the wider conditions of neoliberal urbanism or whatever, or colonisation for that matter. So I think displaceability helps signal the placed aspect of this in a way that's helpful to me.
Great, thanks. The next question comes from somebody called Anonymous Attendee.
Excellent. Hello, Anonymous.
So anonymous attendee says, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I really like your proposition about using the idea of practice of dwelling rather than housing systems. However, it seems that there is an inherent tension in the concept of dwelling, that between the idea of belonging, already being in place, and becoming of the place. In this sense, even the concept of dwelling poses an inherent conflict about land and our relationship with it, those who already belong and those who want to belong. Is there a way out of this tension? And then they go on, property rights offer a solution, but it's not perfect. I'm not sure that's really a solution, property rights.
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, I would want to go back to, because that's what I'm trying to do, go back to learning with Indigenous philosophies of place and ontologies of belonging, because I think they help us break away a little bit from what I think are really kind of narrow ways of understanding what belonging means. You know, I mean, we have a whole set of conceptual tools that we use all the time in geography and planning and you know, other correlate disciplines for thinking about the nature of people-place relationships, like belonging, right? So there's a huge literature on belonging. And I think what I'm trying to say is that it's interesting and useful, it seems to me, from this context, to think about belonging inside the philosophical worldview of what belongs here, which is Wurundjeri ontologies of place. So if we think inside that and learn with those, we actually see a different aspect of belonging, which is a much more expansive, open invitation to belonging, I think. Back to what Arnie Joy said, everyone has a place.
Yeah.
And what Mary Graham said, you are never alone in the world, not only because you're connected to other kin through human connections, but because you're connected to place. You can't be alone. So you already belong where you are. So what I guess I'm trying to say is that this offers this just much more expansive understanding of what it means to belong, that you can't necessarily have that so severed. Maybe you can practice it in different kinds of ways than simply through property rights, or simply through saying, you know, I belong to my suburb of Thornbury because this is where I live, or I belong to, you know, the settler community because of who I am, an uninvited guest here. You know, those kinds of ways of, I belong to lots of other ways of thinking about, you know, social geographies and kinship relations as well. So that's what I'm trying to get to, I suppose.
Thanks. I feel like I'm just firing questions at you now.
No, it's good.
It's you and me firing questions at each other. Well, I'm firing them at you.
It's that weird. It's weird, isn't it? I am following the chat a little bit too.
Like the firing squad. So I've got a question from Emma. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. My question is about learning history of the land. Living in Toronto, I have found it incredibly unsettling to learn about the Indigenous settler histories of this place. How do you think learning the history of the land, in this case with Barrack, for example, can question people's displaceability?
I'm not quite sure I follow, Emma, what you mean by how I think learning the history of the land.
In this case,
yeah, I mean,
Barrack, for example, can question people's displaceability.
I mean, let me just make some comments, I suppose, on why I think it's really important to learn the history of the land, say through the example of William Barrack. I mean, I think one of the political claims, I suppose, certainly of Indigenous peoples all around the world, you would have heard this in Toronto as well, in any colonial context, is to remember and to grapple properly with actual histories. So, you know, in my context here, we're always talking about this as truth telling, right? That, you know, one of the sort of, I suppose, conditions of settler colonialism is to obfuscate, deny, and forget. So for me, the Barrack building isn't a moment of remembering. It's not a memorial that remembers something. It tries to forget what happened here by sort of, you know, papering over it, or literally building on it and you know, building this kind of facade. So I think what we're being invited to do is to learn the history, what actually happened here, in order to understand the forms of displaceability that are at work, that are functioning in the settler-colonial condition, that in fact, as I argued, are constitutive of the settler-colonial condition. It's knitted into, its whole form is about displaceability. That's what it's geared to. And it does that to First Peoples first, and then it also does it to many of the rest of us too. In fact, I think I would argue that it does it to all of us, because I think property regimes just intrinsically try and are dissociative. They try and disconnect us to webs of relationships rather than connect us. You know, even if you're rich, I think that is the case. You're just better placed, right? If you're wealthy.
Okay, I'm
not sure I answered your question, Emma. Come back at me if that was not helpful.
I've got two more questions, and maybe these will be the final ones. I'm not quite sure yet. I've got a question, which is a methodological question from Christine Hannigan. Thank you for your lecture. You mentioned getting more familiar with Indigenous ways of knowing, learning. How did you learn new ways of perceiving, processing information? And what do you think are the best ways planners, etc., should approach this?
That's a lovely question. Thanks, Christine. Well, I don't know if I have a method I can share with you about how I've done it. I think there are some principles that are important, that I think we should hold to. I think we have to get really clear about who we are and where we are situated, what the nature of the relationship is. And obviously I'm speaking here as a white person, as coming from, you know, settler origins, in the work of learning with Indigenous philosophies, because there's, you know, very much a predilection in that whiteness brings to consuming Aboriginal philosophies and sort of presenting them as one's own, or as using them in really slippery ways that then undoes the necessary relationships of you know, not ownership and knowledge production and all those kinds of things. So so I think you have to be really careful of those things. The ways in which I think I've done that that I think are important are just an enormous amount of community-based work, of just basically shutting up and listening. That's really the method, I think. Just of shutting up and listening, getting out of the way, and trying to set aside, unlearn the things that I thought I knew about who I am in this place and how I am in this place, and learning to listen differently with people by sitting alongside them, by being present in different kinds of situations. So making yourself available to learn with people seems tremendously important to me. So I don't know whether that helps.
It does help. Yes, I think that's, yeah, it does. Elia Milner asks, thank you for your fascinating lecture. I wanted to ask if there is any cooperation between Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous peoples in the public housing struggles. Presumably there's a great deal of cooperation.
Very much so, very much so. Although it's patchy, I would say. It's a great question. And I think, again, this is partly why one of the reasons I think that this conceptualization, I think, can really help us, is because it shows the connection between these things. If we, you know, take it at really seriously the notion that the housing crisis began here in Melbourne in 1835. It didn't begin recently, or you know, it doesn't begin with necessarily a class struggle over, you know, the right to shelter or whatever. It began in colonisation. Colonisation is constitutive of this crisis. So you know, I think that's really important. So Indigenous peoples are often saying, and I hear them loud and clear here in this context, to non-Indigenous people who are struggling on these kinds of questions, they are often saying to us, can you please recognise that these are similar things, that your experience here, dear white person or settler or migrant or whoever you are, has a relationship with our experience, that you can't fully know your experience until you bring it into relationship with ours, not to make it the same, but to see its resonance. And quite often that call is either misrecognised if it's seen at all, or unheard, basically. So, for example, whenever I start a public forum or a meeting, of our various collectives and campaigns around public housing, I always open with an acknowledgement. And we always begin by discussing how our campaign relates to these struggles. And quite often I get a lot of pushback from non-Indigenous folk who go, why are we talking about this? This is not, this is irrelevant. There are no Aboriginal people here. They've all gone, blah, blah, blah. So really the problem is on the settler side of the ledger about understanding that connection. I think Indigenous people see it really clearly and are able to make that connection more immediately. And it's our business in those campaigns and struggles to more appropriately make that connection. But they definitely happen. The Bendigo Street occupation is an excellent example of really great solidarity between settlers and migrants who are affected by homelessness and houselessness, and Indigenous people who are struggling for the same things too, because that was a joint collaborative effort.
Great, thanks, Libby. I'm going to ask you to answer one more question. I've got quite a long question from Laura Tate, which I'm going to try and read. I actually left my glasses at work about a year ago, so I'm struggling with the size of the font, but I'll give it a go.
That's an awful thing.
Some interesting cases and ideas, including the thinking around dwelling. I think there is some benefit in exploring some of the complexities associated with title. I am writing from Victoria in British Columbia, traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. Practically speaking, our land reparations are largely being achieved through lands which are publicly owned, and it is clearer, functionally at least, if not airtight in legal terms, that private lands are not up for the taking. Not trying to oversimplify things, but weak settlers who are individual households can also stand to lose a lot when title is not clear. As you have alluded to in your talk, I think that's the end of the question. Was there a question? I think you're being asked to reflect on that.
Sure, and maybe on the
that are on public land versus the relative weakness, shared weakness.
That's very resonant with the situation here, and I think is probably the situation in most settler-colonial contexts, where any claim that's being made, certainly by Indigenous peoples, over their own territory is really only able to be advanced on public land, which also raises the interesting and really important and vital connection that almost never gets spoken about, certainly here in Melbourne, is that the privatisation of public housing land is also a whittling away of the possibility of as we have it at the moment in the legal system here, of recognising Wurundjeri title. So the more that we privatise that, the less country, if you want to think of it in those terms, is available to Wurundjeri people to make claim for within the very confined system of native title recognition that we have here in Australia, that is sort of similar but a little bit different, I think, to the situation where you are in Canada. But that difference between public, something that's in public ownership and something that's in private ownership is really important. So I think that's an important connection to make.
Libby, thank you. We'll end it there. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk this evening. There's been lots of compliments in the chat box. Also, lots of people from all over the world have have tuned in, if I can put it that way. It's a bit old-fashioned, but have tuned in this evening to listen to you. So thank you very much for sharing your research. We hope to see you in person at some point soon. Hopefully, we'll be able to catch up on your sort of continuation of your research at a conference soon, or maybe we'll be able to invite you over here at some point in the future.
That'd be a novel idea, wouldn't it?
It's a novel,
leaving
well,
the airport.
Once you're released from Australia.
Once we're released, yes.
So it won't be this year. But thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. And if you could hear everybody, they would be clapping, and we would all be departing now for drinks in UCL. Unfortunately, that's not possible. But thank you very much for your talk this evening.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick, and UCL. Lovely to see you all. Thanks for your wonderful conversation.
Great.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for now.